All right, everybody. Professor Clark here again for mini lecture number 2 for this week. We've only got one more coming up on Youth to Fro. That'll be posted tomorrow. Um, so today we're going to talk a little bit about, oh, sorry, uh, Dr. Martin Luther King's letter from Birmingham jail. It's a pretty interesting little letter there. It's only about 6 pages, so if you haven't gotten a chance to read it, take a look at it. It's not too bad. And there's a lot of really great stuff in there about politics and some other things. What we're mostly going to be looking at is how Martin Luther King defines a just and an unjust law. That is to say, what does he measure? What does he use to measure a law's justness or unjustness, right? How does he evaluate that? That keyword that we've been talking about here. Um, so, and part of the reason that Martin Luther King has to do this, right, is because the civil rights movement was engaged in actively breaking laws. Uh, so, if they were breaking laws, they had to justify on a moral ground why they should be breaking those laws, right? And on top of that, they were asking white supremacists of the time to follow Supreme Court laws that had just been put into place recently, relatively recently. And they had to justify why people should follow those laws, even though they were in the midst of breaking laws themselves. So it's pretty interesting. And really interesting, Martin Luther King turns to natural law theory. And natural law theory basically is the idea that there is a natural law that governs everything. Um, for Martin Luther King, this natural law comes from a sort of greater, even bigger divine law. But the natural law determines all of the laws of whatever we see in the physical universe, regardless of what its source might be. Um, Although it makes sense that Martin Luther King would view this natural law's source as coming from God or the divine law. Um, and a lot of religious thinkers from various backgrounds subscribe to this natural law theory to one degree or another. They may not necessarily agree on the details of what natural law reveals. They may not agree on the values that it leads to, but they agree on the descriptive claim that there is a natural law that governs kind of everything, including man-made customs and man-made laws. Now, the thing about man-made laws and man-made customs is even though they're governed by the natural law, right? Just because like everything is governed by the natural law, just like the physical universe itself is governed by natural laws of science. So it makes sense that the whole entirety of everything would also be governed by certain natural laws, right? So even our customs and codes and governments would be somewhat guided and determined by these natural laws because we are guided and determined in part by these natural laws, right? But we also have a degree of freedom, and that gets into a whole other thing, right? So man-made laws aren't entirely squared up with the natural law. They can kind of diverge and go off course here. So Martin Luther King is arguing that our way of evaluating, our way of testing laws to see if they're just or unjust is by comparing them to the natural law. Um, Now, when Martin Luther King is talking about laws, he of course is talking about segregation laws, right? In particular, like laws that were actually legislated. But we can expand this to also mean customs, cultures, things like that, things, codes, ways that we just relate to one another, right? Because laws, really, what they are just enforced ways of relating to one another, right? So Martin Luther King says that we can tell if our customs, our codes, our culture, our laws are good if they square with the natural law or the divine law. Um, but that is still a little complicated, right? Because, well, how do you know that you are correct about what the natural or the divine law is? You could be wrong, right? And also, how do you discover the natural law or the divine law? Martin Luther King uses a really big example in his paper, and obviously that's segregation. And he talks about a way that we can tell if man-made law is out of sync with the natural law. If it if it twists what is true about reality. So he talks about this with segregation. He says segregation is unjust because it's a man-made law that doesn't square with the natural law. Now, for him, the natural law is that all humans are essentially equal. We're all essentially the same. Humans are humans, right? There aren't really huge differences between people. People are pretty much mostly the same. Um, Essentially, right, at their core, in their nature, humans are all the same. Um, and he says that this is the natural law. This is the way things are, right? And he pulls this also from his Christianity, believing that people are made in God's image and all that kind of stuff. Right? And he says segregation is immoral because it twists that natural law. It makes us believe that certain people are superior and certain people are inferior based off of skin color in this case. But in a lot of, we could talk about segregation in a lot of different cases, right? In this case, it's skin color, right? It makes us believe that people with white skin are superior than people with dark skin because of a law, right? Because of a man-made code. And this law is incorrect. It's out of sync with the natural law. And so therefore it's unjust. For Martin Luther King, this means that it should be broken. An unjust law should be broken because, like Martin Luther King says, an unjust law is no law at all. Actually, that's a quote from Aquinas, but an unjust law is no law at all. So that's how Martin Luther King determines if a law is just or not, if it squares with the natural law. It's a pretty big argument, especially for something like the civil rights movement. I mean, he was willing to go to jail for these beliefs, right? He was willing to take beatings for these beliefs and even eventually get assassinated, right? And these beliefs, this rhetoric, these ideas inspired obviously a lot of people to also march for their rights as well. When we're thinking about this, I want you to consider for yourself, how do you determine if a law is just or unjust, if it is good or bad, right? Because it seems pretty obvious that on its face, laws aren't necessarily correct. They're not necessarily just. So what makes something just or unjust? Is it Martin Luther King's kind of natural law theory, or is it something else? Leave your responses in the comment section. Look forward to hearing from you guys.